B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Thursday, March 28th, 2019. The New York Post ran a spoof March Madness grid that they called Mueller Madness. And in the brackets are all the offenders of media malpractice who promoted the Russiagate narrative over the last 2 years. And it won't surprise you to learn that the winner has already been determined. Some 1,000 people went online and participated in this little game at the New York Post. And Rachel Maddow is the far-away victor here. And it's interesting because they list Rachel Maddow, comedian John Oliver, Donnie Deutsch from MSNBC, Joe Scarborough, John Brennan. Brennan beat Scarborough in their bracket. Don Lemon at CNN, Chris Hayes, MSNBC, Billy Crystal, not the comedian, the right-wing nut, Natasha Bertrand, Ryan Lizza, Jonathan Chait, Paul Krugman and Jennifer Rubin, Max Boot, Adam Davidson. Now, they limited it to Americans, so some of the Russiagate promoters, like Luke Harding of The Guardian, didn't make the cut. Brian Ross lost his job at ABC for a false report on Russiagate. Stephen Colbert. I actually give the comedians a pass because they're just riffing off the news of the day, and, they're not responsible for the false reporting. They do drive it home, and they deliver news to a lot of people who will never read it in the Washington Post or the New York Times, but you get my point. The original brackets, Colbert was placed with Ken Delanian, one of the alleged intelligence reporters at NBC. He has been responsible for a lot of misleading reports. Michael Avenatti, Benjamin Wittes. Wittes is the guy who did the leaking for James Comey, and he made it to the second round and then was beaten by Alyssa Milano, who beat out Seth Abramson. And by the way, I was offered the opportunity to interview Professor Abramson, and I tried. I looked at his book. I turned it down. Anyway, that's kind of a fun way to deal with a very serious issue. They've given Trump this weapon, fake news, and he is going to wield that all the way through 2020. And this makes it very difficult for those of us who know that Trump is corrupt, that know he's doing deep damage to our system and the policies that were in place before he got there. And all this is at risk because they fed us this bullshit for 2 years. And at The Guardian, which is a big offender here, and once again, we have a great piece of commentary published in an outlet where the opinion maker is not allowed or chooses to censor himself and doesn't mention the obvious sins of the publication from which he is spouting. So in this case, New York-based freelancer Ross Barkan, published in The Guardian, says the worst-kept secret in the liberal media ecosystem is that Donald Trump is great for business. Rebranded for the resistance, liberal newspapers gobbled up thousands of new subscribers, while local outlets die across America, unable to feast on the Trump manna. On television, left-leaning stations at long last competed with Fox in the ratings game, fueled by a never-ending Trump obsession. And he continues, Mueller's determination that no evidence exists to prove Trump and Russia colluded to fix the election has exposed once again the venality of A-list political punditry. At the top of the heap is none other than Rachel Maddow. Then he quotes Dean Baquet, the New York Times executive editor. Do you remember that bizarre kind of documentary on HBO? It was in 3 or 4 parts. It was the New York Times behind the scenes as they worked to bring us the Russiagate story. That type of self-promotion was really bizarre. Well, Dean Baquet says, we wrote a lot about Russia, and I have no regrets. Well, He added, "It's not our job to determine whether or not there was illegality." What about false reporting? What about accepting from anonymous sources and leakers information that you couldn't verify? What about publishing so-called evidence that was read to you over the phone by a source? Those are some of the below-the-belt tactics that the New York Times used to generate, day after day, the Russiagate reporting. Jeff Zucker at CNN also unbowed. "We're not investigators. We're journalists, and our role is to report the facts as we know them," which is exactly what we did. No, you went well beyond the facts into speculation, innuendo, connecting dots without evidence, treating unproven information as fact, repeatedly. Back to Barkan's comments. The Mueller investigation was covered more on MSNBC than any other television network and was mentioned virtually every day in 2018. No twist was too minuscule or outlandish for Maddow. Every night seemingly brought another nail in the coffin to the soon-to-be-dead Trump presidency. And that's why I call it a telenovela. She repeats the same stuff over and over again, adding just a little bit of new information. And in the past few days, she has pivoted away from exclusively Russiagate coverage, following the Democrats in challenging Trump on the attack on Obamacare, and also broadening out the scope of her coverage to include more negative reporting on Republicans, not just Trump. But no moment of reflection, no special message from Rachel. "You know, I went fishing in Tennessee and I didn't catch anything, and I spent 2 years fishing on Mueller and on Russiagate, and I came up with the same." Nope, she has not a moment of introspection or self-criticism, and I think this is going to hurt her. So let's see, what else does Barkan say here? Okay, we'll go to the end. "In this mythos, America was an unsullied country until Kremlin power brokers dropped Trump in the White House to control from afar. It is the Cold War paradigm reborn, Russia the dark nemesis that must be slayed. Just as conservatives once ranted about communist infiltrations into all facets of American life, it's liberal Democrats who now see Russia in every Trump foible." And the big news that Rachel and other people obsessed on last night was, how many pages are there in the Mueller report? And Jerry Nadler, the Democratic chair of the House Judiciary Committee, had talked to Attorney General Bill Barr, and he had been told the number of pages, but said he couldn't relay that to the media. And so there was speculation that it was 700 pages, and now we're told that it's over 300. And the only thing that surfaces from that is, well, can you summarize that into 4 pages? And I don't trust the summary that Bill Barr has written. It is clearly spin. But it's all we've got. And we do have to cross our fingers and hope that he didn't try trickery to the degree that we will be surprised when the full report, or most of the report, finally sees public light. And today it's the Washington Post that continues false reporting about Maria Butina. We talked about this yesterday. She was in court yesterday. She will be sentenced on April 26th. And in a brief story about that, the Washington Post continues to promote the mythology that she's a significant Russian spy, and they even mischaracterize the nature of the plea deal that she has taken. And buried in the story, they note that Mueller's office interviewed her for about an hour once. Her case has otherwise been handled entirely by the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia. Assigned prosecutors saw it as unrelated to President Trump and his 2016 election win. But you wouldn't know that from the headline of the Washington Post. You wouldn't know that from the coverage of Rachel Maddow. And I ask you to continue to listen to me critically, push back when you hear things that you don't agree with or you don't think are correct. And you've got to consume media very critically. Ask yourself, what did they just tell me and what did they leave out? And that will center you in dealing with this wave of yellow journalism that we've had to deal with the past 2 years. Ralph Nader over at Common Dreams reviews the Mueller report. He says it took 2 years to produce a $25 million report that is a flat tire. What a farce and distraction this whole exercise turned out to be, says Ralph. The guy who killed the Corvair says, what should we have expected from someone who, as FBI director, testified before Congress as part of the Bush-Cheney regime pushing for the criminal invasion of Iraq in 2003? The assignment to Mueller was doomed from the start, says Nader. And he's correct. Now, I don't agree with his comment here. The Russians interfered in Trump's favor in various ways to the detriment of Hillary Clinton, and all he had to do was accept such foreign largesse. The largesse came domestically. We know that. But he goes on to enumerate many of the issues of Trump that we've been distracted away from by Russiagate. And near the conclusion, he writes, never mind impeachment. Millions of Trump's victims, regardless of how they voted in 2016, should demand his resignation. 1 million people march should surround the White House and peacefully make this demand repeatedly. Well, I don't think the yellow vest strategy is going to make much difference. But I think it's worth a try. And is there a way to shame Trump? I think I've already answered that question. I got a Valentine, a little late, but it came from Julie Dupree. Dear Peter, congratulations on your astute skepticism regarding the Russiagate story. Vindication is your victory. It's okay with me if you gloat some. You must be pleased to find yourself in good journalistic company. As always, thank you for your thoughtful and unbiased views. Well, my views are pretty biased, Julie. It appears our biases match, and that's fine. She goes on, I appreciate your daily news and comment podcast and in-depth interviews. Your work is continually top quality, makes me feel that I am not losing my mind. No, you're not, Julie. We all are. And since I mentioned a great listener and subscriber, let me pause as I do every day to thank the people who support my work with your subscriptions. Out in Maine, Abby McMillan, who hosted me for a great dinner in Maine last summer. She's still kicking in $20 a month. Gene Hetzel just renewed an annual subscription. Susan Luis and Alice Carlson are both monthly contributors. And I say that to encourage you, not to shame you, or I don't think it would intimidate anybody. But I do encourage you to support me because that's how I pay the bills, and someday I hope to retire with all the money I make from the podcast. You want to sign up? Visit peterbcollins.com. Find the menu tab. Click on Become a Subscriber. When you're on the sign-up page, you can choose $5, $10, $20 a month, a new $50 annual subscription, and a mailing address in the continental U.S. earns you the bonus book. It's currently Justin Frank's Trump on the Couch, and it's quite a piece of analysis. I'd love to send you a copy. I just have 2 left, so don't delay. Mint Press News is an outlet that I look at every day, and one of their lead reporters, Whitney Webb, impresses me. I've never talked to her, don't know her, other than her byline, and it reveals that she lives in Chile. So she does incredible reporting from South America. And the dateline today is Damascus, where Webb reports that the U.S. has rejected offers to resolve the growing humanitarian crisis in the Rukban refugee camp in Syria. There are 40,000 people holed up there. These are refugees, many of whom want to go back to their towns in Syria that they evacuated because of the occupation by the Islamic State. Now, the U.S. has refused to let any of them leave voluntarily. We are holding them hostage. The U.S. has been accused of refusing to let civilians leave the area because the camp's presence helps to justify America's illegal occupation of the area. And we've long rationalized presence in the Al-Tanf area as necessary to defeat the Islamic State. Now we say that war is over. The caliphate is gone. But we haven't left. And it appears that this is part of our brinksmanship with Iran. And earlier this week, delegations from Russia, Syria, United Nations, and the Ruckman refugee camp met to discuss the fate of the people who are trapped there. But the U.S. military and State Department officials in nearby Jordan refused to attend the meeting. So this is another hostage scene controlled by Donald Trump. Now, he says he wants to withdraw all U.S. troops from Syria, but John Bolton won't let him. Al-Tanf was a training camp for those moderate rebels that we spent billions on, and they all just evaporated in the Syrian desert. So I commend Mint Press News for breaking a story that I have seen absolutely nowhere else. And it reminds us that the Kurds, the so-called Free Syrian Army that the U.S. has been propping up, they face slaughter, either by the Assad government or by the Turks, unless we have some secret plan to find a place and a shelter for them. So it's an ugly end game in Syria. And I need to point out once again, we're going to talk about the Democratic presidential candidates and their positions on war and peace in a moment. But Tulsi Gabbard is the only candidate I've heard tell the truth. That the U.S. CIA covertly helped start the civil war in Syria. And that we were banking on that cover to take out Assad when the Islamic State surprised us and took over huge swaths of western Iraq and parts of Syria. So this is just another scummy regime change effort by the United States. And no, we will never learn. Meanwhile, there are more Trump hostages stacking up at the Mexican border. And while his hysterical claims of a crisis leading to his bizarre declaration of emergency so he can steal money from one government account to build his wall, well, the flow of migrants is actually catching up to his hysteria. Arrests on the Mexico border jumped to 66,450 in February. That is a 150% increase from last year, as more Central American families seek asylum. The Border Protection Chief said that the agency is on track to make 100,000 arrests or denials of entry during the month of March, up about 30% from February and double the same period last year. Nearly 60% of those arriving are families. This is overwhelming our capacities. Hundreds of recently apprehended migrants are now spending hours in a chain-link cage just across the bridge from El Paso in Ciudad Juarez. And the border people are saying they have to redeploy people who run these silly internal citizenship inspection stops that are, hundreds of miles from the border. So they are redeploying their human resources. And I find this very interesting. Trump made it very clear when Jeff Sessions ordered the zero-tolerance policy and the child separation policy. They're simply trying to make it as unattractive as possible to those who seek to flee poverty and violence in Central America. And instead, the perverse impact of zero tolerance is that more and more people are saying, this may be my last chance to get into the U.S. before Trump builds that frickin' wall. I'm going. And it just shows how totally backward the U.S. approach is. And I want to thank Jerry Fresha. He sent me another article here from Vox explaining how a colleague of his, whose name is David Brotherton from the City University of New York, argues that efforts to pathologize gangs and their violent behavior often just totally backfires. And so this guy Brotherton has championed the approach of not criminalizing gangs, not trying to police them out of existence, but recognizing them and converting them into social and cultural organizations. And in Ecuador, 10 years ago, actually 12 years ago, they began a program where across the entire country, Ecuador legalized gangs. And, well, 12 years later, the murder rate has dropped drastically, and the members are active in their gangs, but they're functioning like social movements or cultural groups. Previously violent Latin kings were working in everything from catering to crime analysis, and they're collaborating with other gangs that they had fought with in the past. I'm linking to this article that includes an interview with David Brotherton, and I think it's a real eye-opener. And when you hear Trump talk about MS-13, which, of course, originated in Los Angeles and metastasized when we deported some of those individuals to El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, maybe that's what we need to take a fresh look at. I had hoped to bring you an in-depth interview today with Dan Kovalik. His latest book is called The Plot to Control the World, and it's all about the way the U.S. has been involved in rigging elections or staging political coups in nations all over the world. And this goes back ages, but his book basically starts after World War II. Dan also wrote the book about Russiagate, published in 2017. And I had hoped to give him an opportunity to take a victory lap on his prescience on that story. Unfortunately, Dan Kovalik is in Venezuela, in Caracas, and I don't know if the power was out or the internet was down or both, but we were unable to connect today. We'll reschedule for when he returns to the U.S. sometime in the next week or two. Meanwhile, the Maduro government in Caracas has barred opposition leader Juan Guaido from holding public office for 15 years. Now, Guaido says that he will continue his campaign to oust Maduro, and Guaido's wife got a photo op with Trump in the Oval Office yesterday and then went and rallied some Puerto Ricans in New York. Excuse me, Venezuelans, not Puerto Ricans. My next story is about Puerto Rico. Anyway, I think this is an interesting move, and it shows that Maduro is intent on holding on to the levers of power. I want to acknowledge that one of our listeners, Kat McGuire, has published a letter from a friend in Venezuela that describes the conditions there as very, very difficult. Many people who have means, who live in their own home, haven't had water, have had spotty electricity for the last 3 weeks. Food and medical supplies are in very short order if they're available. And it is a difficult situation. I don't deny the suffering of the Venezuelan people. But the idea that Juan Guaido, with the help of his fast friends in the humanitarian wing of the Trump government, like Bolton and Pompeo and Elliott Abrams, that they're going to ease the plight of the Venezuelan people if we just bounce Maduro from the presidency? Sorry, I don't buy it. Now to Puerto Rico. The Trump administration has been hammering Congress. There is a bill to provide relief for hurricanes, for the California wildfires, but Trump really wants to stiff Puerto Rico. I don't quite understand why. They're still in dire straits from Hurricane Maria, and the electrical grid there is a mess. And Congressman Darren Soto, a Democrat from Florida, has introduced legislation which doesn't directly relate to the earthquake or hurricane relief, but it is a move to grant statehood to make Puerto Rico the 51st state. Now, I have long supported statehood for Puerto Rico and for the District of Columbia. I think it is time. And here's what's interesting. The governor of Puerto Rico, Ricardo Rossello, really embarrassed himself kissing Trump's ass in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria. But he's not kissing ass anymore. He told CNN he will not allow the island's government to be bullied by the White House. Quote, "If the bully gets close, I'll punch the bully in the mouth." Wow. And even Republican Senators Rubio and Scott from Florida say they will support statehood for Puerto Rico if that's what Puerto Ricans want. A couple of teenage activists from the East Coast who are fed up with the Democratic Party's bullshit, as they put it, have recruited Mike Gravel, my old buddy, the retired senator from Alaska, the guy who originally read the Pentagon records into the Congressional Record, a man who I enjoy quite a bit personally, and he ran for president in 2007 in the 2008 cycle, and a lot of people thought he was a kooky old man. But Mike Gravel makes important points about American imperialism and about the runaway surveillance state. He is a constitutionalist and a populist who wants to give real power to the people. So these two young guys, David Oakes, age 17, and his friend Henry Williams, age 18, reached out to Mike Gravel. And initially he said, "Nah, I'm 88 years old and come on." Then they presented him with a position paper, and Mike Gravel said, all right. So they filed paperwork with the Federal Elections Commission. Gravel says, "I'm not running to win. I am running to disrupt the status quo." And I certainly welcome his entry into the race. What does that make, 16? There's a great piece by Jeff Cohen, former journalism professor, who published at Common Dreams in the last couple of days, a piece saying, let's not restore or mythologize Obama. And it's an excellent and honest recap of what we really experienced under President Barack Obama. And he says, look, given what Trump has done to our country and world, it's no wonder that many Americans long for Obama. He wasn't a bigot or insult artist. His administration wasn't rocked by major scandal. He was level-headed. He didn't deny science. He was smart. He had a vocabulary exceeding that of a fourth-grade child. He was hip. And he says, I remember all that, but we should also recall the political substance beyond the pleasant image. And then he talks about how Obama essentially paved the way for the rise of Trump, that he was against the Iraq invasion, but once he defeated Hillary in the primary, he chose pro-war running mate Joe Biden and surrounded himself by war hawks and Wall Street warriors as well. He appointed a Monsanto executive to key food and agriculture jobs. His health care reform was a Republican-originated measure. And there's much more in this piece. And I encourage you to take a look. There's a link in the show file at peterbcollins.com. There's also a link to this great piece that was published and co-authored by Medea Benjamin at Truth Out just a day or two ago. Here's how the 2020 candidates stack up on war and peace. And it's a really helpful guide. It is, I think, very even-handed. It names Bernie Sanders as the most consistently pro-peace and anti-war candidate. He has voted against Pentagon funding. He's voted against it 16 out of 19 times in recent years. One major contradiction in Sanders' opposition to out-of-control military spending has been his support of the trillion-dollar F-35 fighter jet. So you can see that they're being honest and not trying to paper over any of the candidates' positions. They ranked Tulsi Gabbard as the number 2 candidate on war and peace. She was truly impressive in her March 10 CNN town hall, talking more honestly about U.S. wars than any other presidential candidate in recent history. And they rank Elizabeth Warren as third. As I say, I hope you will click on the link and peruse that article for yourselves. I'm glad to see that some progressive Democrats in the House, led by Ro Khanna of Silicon Valley, are challenging the decision by Congresswoman Cheri Bustos, who is running the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. And they strongly oppose her new policy that stifles competition and blackballs any consultant who works for a challenger in a Democratic primary. And I'm pleased to see them standing up. Quoting Ro Khanna, this unprecedented grab of power is a slap in the face of Democratic voters across the nation. It's something even Rahm Emanuel would not have done when he ran the DCCC in 2006. Glad to see them fighting that. Yesterday, the jury that found Monsanto guilty of the exposure to cancer that affected the plaintiff in the case, Edwin Hardeman. Well, the jury found that Roundup glyphosate did cause his cancer, and they've awarded him $80 million, $200,000 for economic losses, $5 million for pain and suffering, and a $75 million punitive damage award. In the previous case, the judge slashed the punitive award, and we have to be prepared for that to happen again here. And finally today, here's another reason to be wary of 5G wireless technology. Oh, it's supposed to be 100 times faster. But Britain's intelligence agency, the GCHQ, has identified serious concerns about equipment made by the Chinese telecom company Huawei. And they've identified these issues, and the central issue is they think that they're embedding spy gear in there, and once they roll out 5G, they'll be able to spy on Americans with ease. And finally today, I want to thank Billy Cook in Eureka for tipping me off about this story. Ivanka Trump says that she has shut down her company, the eponymous Ivanka Trump Inc., or whatever it was. But yesterday, China granted her trademarks, and they were for lipsticks and jewelry and sunglasses and handbags and voting machines. Voting machines? What? Ivanka has a line of voting machines? Really? I can only ask the question. I don't have any more information to share with you about that. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it far and wide. You'll find it on YouTube, and I'm still Peter B.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.